Hey guys, we're moving forward in our summer reading plan, teaching alongside that this summer. We're going to be looking at James chapter 3, verses 13 through 18 this week, and we'll be focused on the topic of wisdom. And it's going to be a little bit different for discussion groups this week, at least at the beginning. I'm going to close the lesson with one final question that I didn't have time to address, but I want us to address. So I'm going to kind of cue that up for discussion groups, and you guys will open with that. So we'll look at earthly wisdom and how James describes that, and wisdom that comes from above and how he describes that. But the question that you guys are going to start with in your groups is, how do we get heavenly wisdom? So we know what it is, we know why we want it, but how do we actually get it? And a couple answers for that. If you've been paying attention to James as they were reading this week, famously in James chapter 1, verse 5, he says, if anyone lacks wisdom, let him ask God, who gives generously. So we need to ask. Wisdom that comes from above is not natural. It doesn't live inside of you for you to just draw out. It's something we need to ask God to give to us. So that's part of the answer. We'll also say in the lesson that wisdom requires knowledge. Knowledge and wisdom aren't the same thing, but in order to be wise, you also have to have some knowledge. So growing in our ability to answer what we'll say is the key question and motive of wisdom from above. The question is, what is right in God's eyes? So we need to grow in our ability to know the answer to that question in all sorts of different situations, to be able to discern what is good and pleasing to the Lord in all different situations. So knowledge, gaining knowledge is part of it, asking the Lord is part of it, but a part I want you to focus on is beholding Christ, that Paul says in 1 Corinthians chapter 1, verse 24, that we looked at in life groups, that Christ is wisdom from God. So he's the embodiment of wisdom from above. And so as we look at Christ and his life and ministry, we see him perfectly displaying all the attributes that we'll talk about on Sunday. And so we not only look to him to see what wisdom actually looks like in a human being, but as we look to Christ, we also gain a willingness and a desire to put that wisdom into practice and to make it our own. So I've got some examples for you down here of how Christ embodies peace and mercy and gentleness and purity and sincerity and all of those things, and how as we look at those characteristics in him, it actually develops a willingness and a desire for us to put those characteristics into practice in our own lives. And so we want, this is an important question because we want the message not to just be a message of good advice, you should be like this and not like this, but how we actually get there is not through just gritting our teeth and trying really hard and trying to pull this out from within ourselves, but we actually look to Christ, and as we do that, he transforms us into this image of perfect wisdom. Next question is to go to James chapter 4. So we're going to be looking at the end of James chapter 3. And you can just read the first 3 verses of James chapter 4 and then ask the question, how does that relate to what we just talked about at the end of James chapter 3? I'm going to kind of already reference this a little bit in the lesson, that it seems like James is focused on relationships and conflict in both passages, but even more than that, in chapter 4, what you want them to pull out is that in chapter 4, James continues to seem to say that quarrels and fights and disunity are caused and driven by our own selfish ambition. So that'll be a big theme that we focus on in earthly wisdom, is driven by selfish ambition. And James kind of continuing that theme into chapter 4, he says that quarrels and fights happen because you desire and you don't have. You are driven by selfish ambition, and that leads to conflict. So see if they can pull that out of James chapter 4 for themselves. If not, you guys can try to lead them along that path. Next question something I meant to bring up at Dutch Bros, but wasn't able to. That I think I mentioned it briefly with my group. James, we talked about him being the half-brother of Jesus, and so obviously he was around for a lot of Jesus' ministry, would have heard a lot of Jesus' teachings, been influenced by him, even though he wasn't believing at the time. And so a lot of people read James and they can see obvious parallels, like a lot of his teaching is really similar and kind of building on what Jesus taught in the Gospels. And specifically, they say James is really kind of expounding a lot on the Sermon on the Mount. Much of James can be connected back to Jesus' teaching in Matthew 5 through 7. So inform them of that, since we didn't get to talk about that on Wednesday, and then ask them, can you think of any place in the Sermon on the Mount that sounds really similar or would be connected maybe to the passage that we just read in James chapter 3 and heard a lesson on? The answer is the Beatitudes. So heavenly wisdom is going to be described as being peaceable and merciful and pure, and all of these things that are paralleled with the Beatitudes. Blessed are the peacemakers, blessed are those who show mercy, blessed are the pure, humility, blessed are the poor in spirit. So you want to see if they can get that answer. Again, if not, see if you can try to lead them there. And then I would go to Matthew chapter 5 and read the Beatitudes and have them kind of draw those connective dots between the two passages so that they can see those connections. Question number 4 is we'll talk in the beginning that James seems to be saying to us that if you want to evaluate if someone is wise, you should look at their relationships, and particularly you should look at how they handle conflict in their relationships. And so this question is, what areas do people typically tend to look at in order to evaluate if people are wise or not? So James says we should look at relationships to try to evaluate this. What are maybe the places that we might be prone to look first if we're going to try to figure out, is somebody else wise or not? And I've got a couple of answers there. I'm sure you guys and students can come up with more. I think obvious ones are we tend to look at how people handle their finances as a really strong indication of wisdom. And certainly there's wisdom in handling your finances well. But James seems to think that it's displayed more clearly in our relationships. Sometimes we look at people's careers. How successful are they? How far have they been able to advance themselves? Again, that kind of, as you hear the lesson, that'll play more into earthly wisdom than heavenly wisdom. And then there's kind of a two-part question. So what areas do people tend to look at to see if people are wise? And then what should we learn, or what can we learn from the fact that James is ushering us to look at our relationships as the gauge of how wise we really are? And I think that just connects back to the center of Christianity, that Christianity is built on loving God and loving neighbor. It's built on relationships. And so naturally, Christianity is going to judge your wisdom based on how you handle your relationships with the Lord and also with other people. That would be naturally the place to look to see who's truly wise, who's wise from a heavenly perspective. The last two questions you may or may not have time for. I'm going to go ahead and go over them. Always want to give you guys freedom to pop around. If one of the questions I've already gone through you think is not good for middle school, or it won't be good for my group, or I just don't get it, you can skip it. So these are extra questions. You're not going to get through all of these, but feel free to pick and choose which ones you go to. Question number 5 is, how do you go about evaluating your motives in conflict and in relationship? So that would be a centerpiece of our discussion, that earthly wisdom and heavenly wisdom are motivated by two different things. So how do I know if my motives are pure, that I'm being driven and motivated by the right thing? Lots of potential answers to that question. Last one, how can we avoid becoming unwilling to engage in conflict or over eager to engage in conflict? So we'll talk a little bit about how The fact that heavenly wisdom is peaceable and gentle and merciful doesn't mean that you just avoid conflict altogether or are never willing to step into conflict. But there's a balance. As a Christian, we don't want to be cowardly and unwilling to engage in any sort of conflict, but we also don't want to be characterized by stirring up conflict and enjoying it. So how do we find that middle ground? How can we avoid sliding into one side of the ditch or the other? Again, lots of potential answers to that question. That's one where you can just get a lot of discussion flowing. All right, I will see you guys on Sunday. Thanks for all you do.